Afternoon, I'll call the meeting to order. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we're in Treaty 1 territory and the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. Members on the panel today, to my far left is Ms. Linda McFadgen. To my immediate left is Mr. Robert Phillip. My name is Stu McPherson. I'll be chairing the hearing today. Representing the City of Winnipeg Assessment Taxation Department is Mr. Jamie Fougere. And the recording secretary today is Ms. Kelsey Harrison. We'll be hearing applications for revision of the assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application. We'll limit discussion to those matters. Statements that applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Please be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the Board of Revision. The Board of Revision is appointed annually by Council. It's independent of it and the City Administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at this hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note the Board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, or to the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the Board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I'll confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We'll then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions the applicant may have, and then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they so wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave, and the process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the Board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You'll receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. Just as information, all public hearings are live streamed, recorded, and will be part of the public record. If you have a cell phone, please put that on silent, and I'll have you swear the parties in, please.
Do you swear in or affirm?
I'll swear.
Could you please state your name?
Jamie Fougere.
And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. And
I'll swear.
could you please state your name?
Rod Slaughter.
And do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Afternoon, Mr. Slaughter. You're here representing the owners of 7 properties. It's the amount of assessed value only that we're dealing with today?
That's correct.
Thank you. We'll just deal with them as they're listed on the docket today.
Sure.
So, Mr. Assessor, the first property we'll deal with is 1115 Nairn. When you're ready, we'll hear from you, please.
So I have a recommendation, and I actually have, just to give you a heads up, I have a recommendation for all of them. And I think we're in agreement with all of them, although I'll let the applicant determine that, except for one.
Okay. So you'll give us the recommendation and the basis for that?
Yes.
Thank you.
So real quickly, the first property on the docket is 1150 Nairn Avenue. The roll number is 14100043300. And if you wanted to take a look at page 28 and 29, just to see the property, and it continues on page 30 as well. Just right at the very end of the brief. If you wanted to turn to page 6 of my brief is the original summary of the assessment. And so we've done a few things here. If you can compare the two, we've adjusted the rental rates, going mostly with actuals here. We've kept the, we've raised the vacancy allowance to 25%, because there's two of the largest units here are vacant actually. So 21,981 square feet and 20,391 are both vacant. Next, we've matched the capitalization rates at 7.3. And you can see here, there's a small calculation for the gas station that's at the front. Using the rental or the NOI of 27,207, capitalized at 7.3%. And then we've added back in the gas equipment. If you notice that the gas equipment has a slightly different value, basically our system didn't properly calculate the depreciation on the cost of the equipment. So that's where that small adjustment has come in. So the new value that we're proposing is $10,147,000. $10,147,000.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, are you in agreement with this?
We are, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to point out that when we're agreeing to the values, we're agreeing to the value as a whole, but not necessarily individual rates or allowances.
Any questions or concerns, Ms. McFadden?
None.
Mr.
No
Phillips?
questions. It's quite clear.
I just had a couple things here. This additional building value on the neighborhood shopping center portion, what was that for?
That was a stray costing item. I don't recall if it was canopy or a pump, but basically from the gas station, it wasn't pointing to the right income stream there.
Okay, so you just removed that altogether?
So it was part of the recalculation. As I say, the depreciation wasn't adding up properly in the system.
Okay, and the vacancy of 25%, that's due to the two larger CRUs?
Correct.
Have they been vacant for a while?
They have, yes. I think approximately 2013.
Yeah. There was, of the 4 units, just for some background, what this was, it was an old Zellers.
Sorry?
It was an old Zellers. The entire 4 CRUs was one large and it had been vacated. So a number of years ago, the owner, without the ability to find a tenant of that size, demised the space into 4 larger units. So you have long, large bay units. And the problem is that there was no loading for many of those units because the loading was only accessible through one side for a single tenant. And they found themselves in a position where since that time, at least for the last 10 years, they've always had 2 units vacant. Shapes was the best thing that happened to them because they don't require loading. So Shapes Gym took the middle unit. Originally they had 2 units. One of the units that they did manage to get a tenant for from 2011 to 2015 was a tenant who only paid $3.75 a square foot. Otherwise they've been consistently 50% vacant, and they are doing their best. They can't get anybody to agree to these spaces. So it's a chronic situation.
Thank you. Nothing further to add then, Mr. Slaughter?
No, that's fine. Thank you very much.
For 1600 region? When you're ready, Mr. Assessor.
So the property here is 1600 Region Avenue West. The roll number is 090103746000. And again, at the very rear of my brief, I have some pictures. And this is actually just the block over from the last property. So you can see that there's a mall with a gas station at the front, and then at the rear, I believe it was completed in 2015 or 16, there is a Good Life Fitness at the rear. And so, again, as mentioned, have a recommendation. So, to get a bird's eye view of the income streams as they were originally assessed, you can turn to page 9 and 10 in my brief. So I say 9 and 10 because there's in fact 4 income streams that were originally sent out. So we have 2 neighborhood shopping center streams, one of which is partially exempt. It's the WASO unit. I believe it's a nonprofit of some type. Then the second stream that we have here is the retail warehouse, and that's actually referring to the building at the rear, which has the Good Life Fitness. Third stream is the gas station, and then the fourth stream on the flip side of the page is the neighborhood shopping center, but class 60T, so that's all the other units in the neighborhood shopping center. So it's a lot to take in there. We are proposing to reduce the number of streams. We are keeping the gas station stream at the front, and we still will need a separate value for the partially exempt stream. However, the way that it has gone out, it actually was receiving a lower cap rate than the rest of the neighborhood shopping center. So we're willing to value that all the same. So again, we've started with actuals with our recommendation here. And in lieu of what was going on with the property itself and the NOIs, largely we tried to focus on the end result of the net operating incomes. And so that's really where we focused in on. So we've adjusted the vacancy allowance as well as the shortfall. And we've used the 7.3% cap basically across the board here. And so this results in a value for the mall as well as the gas equipment. That comes out to a value you can see on the second page of the recommendation. Comes out to $13,464,000. And then when you break it down and break it apart with the partially exempt space, that's $350,000, and the 60T taxable is $13,114,000.
And that's the basis of your recommendation.
Right.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, are you in agreement with the value?
We are, thank you.
Any questions, Ms. McFadden?
None.
Mr. Phillip?
No, it's good. I follow it, thank you.
Thank you. 1105 Gateway.
Do you happen to have one more?
Oh.
It may have.
I can give you mine.
I found it.
Oh, okay.
Okay, when you're ready, Mr. Assessor.
So this property is 1105 Gateway Road. The roll number is 0400703200. And again, at the very rear of the brief, you can see some pictures of the subject property. It has an Integra credit union at the front, and then it has a basically a strip mall at the rear. Now, with this property, vacancy has been a significant issue. My understanding is that they were in hopes to build a strip mall to the rear of the property, but they had been waiting a few years before they got enough tenants. And it's been around since 2015, and it's only about 50% leased at the rear, the strip mall at the rear of the property. So if you take a look at our recommendation, on the first page here, this is the strip mall. We've used a combination of actuals. You can see 2583, 2214, 2448, and so on. However, you can see just about every other one here, we've used a rate of $12. That's because it's vacant shell space that really has no finish. As well, a couple of those units are actually right behind the credit union, so it gets less exposure. But they are not finished, so we've used that rate. And we've allowed for 18.25% vacancy, and we've adjusted the capitalization rate as well. So in lieu of having the two streams, the bank and the strip mall, we're proposing having one stream and calling it a neighborhood shopping center. And so that will have a small effect on the bank on the subsequent page, if you want to take a look. We've again adjusted the capitalization rate as well as the vacancy, now matching that of the neighborhood shopping center as opposed to a standalone bank. So we believe the dynamics of the property as one economic unit is more reflective of the neighborhood shopping center rather than a property that could be subdivided into multiple roles potentially. So in total, the value that we're recommending is $4,538,000.
Thank you, Mr. Slaughter, are you in agreement with that value?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Again, not necessarily with the rates or allowances individually, but the owner has accepted that overall value.
Thank you. Ms. McFadden, questions?
Nope.
Mr. Phillip? Just a question, you've applied a $12 rate, which is probably about half of what the others are commanding.
Right.
Because you said it's a shell, and then you've given it 18.25% vacancy, which I'm assuming is like 4 or 5 times market rent. Is that not accounting for it twice?
Well, we've tried to reflect the condition of the property that it's in, so it's in an unfinished state. And then separately, we've tried to account that even with you know, attempts at negotiation with prospective clients, this is what they've been able to lease up their store to about 50%.
Okay, thank you.
So these units aren't rentable?
They are rentable, but they'll require either tenant inducements to get them up and started, or a fit up of some kind.
So there's still some construction work to do to fit the client?
Right. And so usually I think a property owner might keep it bare so that when a prospective tenant comes, they can build it to suit.
Okay, thank you. Anything further, Mr. Slaughter?
No, I guess further to that point though, the question would be, is it capable of occupancy from the city standpoint for permits? And it would not be, because it's just bare shell space that still have to connect HVAC and plumbing, etc. So that's one of the factors that we discuss when we talk about the physical condition of the space, notwithstanding the market for the vacancy. So the legislation actually allows 2 years from the time of construction if it's not capable of occupancy. So these units would need to be assessed, and then once the 2 years is up, the clock starts, but of course we have to reflect the condition. So that's kind of expanding on that logic a bit.
But this is older than 2 years, is it not?
It's past 2 years, it's been 3 years now. So now the clock is running.
That's why there's a value placed.
That's right, yeah. If this was last assessment cycle, we would probably argue that it shouldn't be included at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, next we'll deal with 107 Vermilion. Yep. When you're ready, Mr. Assessor, where can you please?
So the property that we're looking at here is 107 Vermilion Road. The roll number is 0600766510. And we have pictures at the rear of my brief. So this is along Furmore. There's several roll numbers sort of connecting neighborhood shopping center properties. This one here has the A&W and the Perkins. And there's a RBC Bank as well. I believe it's Fountain Tire. And Shapes at the rear. And so this is another case where we had a number of streams, and we've tried to simplify it here. Because the concept is that a neighborhood shopping center is sort of a variety of property types that are all on one parcel. And realistically, they're one economic unit, and this property is basically landlocked along Furmore there. And in a case like this, we think it's unlikely that it would be divided up into multiple roll numbers. So we're trying to value it in a more simple way here by recognizing that through the neighborhood shopping center property type. So, I'm trying to verify if I have. Yeah, so on the second page of my recommendation, I've just noticed that I have the wrong classification code. So it's 40E, not 40S. 40E. So again, we've used the actuals as a starting point. We've also adjusted the vacancy, the shortfall, and in a couple cases, the capitalization rate has all been matched to 7.15. So the total breaks down, the total I should say is 13,906,000, and it breaks down to 13,497,000 for 60T, and then 409,000 for 40E.
And that's your recommendation?
Yes, please.
Mr. Slaughter, in agreement with the value?
Yes, and thank you, Mr. Fugere, for the change in the classification. I didn't catch that.
Yeah.
While on this topic, though, I just think as a side note, I'd like to make mention of one thing, if I may.
Just see if the panel has any questions before. Mr.
I
Tadger?
don't.
Mr. Phillip?
I was just curious, is this Perkins closed?
I think it has closed more recently, but I can't confirm that.
About 3 years, I think.
Oh, okay.
I think so.
Right.
But are they still paying the lease though?
Let's see what we have here, 2017. They're still on the roll in 2017. Beyond that, I couldn't answer that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't think they're listing it though, so I think it's still actually under lease.
Okay, anything further, Mr. Phillip?
No.
Did I hear you say that there's not a gas kiosk on this?
Not a
one?
gas kiosk, no. I believe it's a garage of some kind, though. I think it's a
Yeah,
fountain
it's
tire.
Cal Tire, I think.
Cal tire,
Oh, the fountain tire you're talking
Or
about?
Fountain Tire.
fountain tire.
Okay, well, your one comment about it being landlocked and probably not subdividable, is it not the same owner that owns the surrounding properties?
I believe they own a few. I don't know if they own the, necessarily the one immediately to the west. I think that might be Safeway or, but I could be incorrect about
Yeah,
that.
I think they own the land, actually. I think it's pad leases.
Okay, thank you. You had a comment, Mr. Solari?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, and again, I appreciate Mr. Fuget's analysis and recommendation on the property, but the concept of blending everything together for the retail, I just wanted to express the concern that our clients have at times with that concept. I completely agree from a market standpoint, one cap rate would likely apply and somebody would be purchasing as a whole. But just from the tax side, what often happens is, especially in retail, many of the standalone tenants, and you see this especially with regional shopping malls, will have leases where they are paying taxes based on their contribution to the assessment. And so what that means is that the owners or the managers much prefer to have separate income streams so that if there isn't an appeal, they're able to ascertain how much of an assessment is pertainable to, for example, McDonald's. So I just wanted to mention that for the city's consideration, that I understand the blending together, and I think uniform cap rates and such often make sense, but I would encourage the city to maintain separate income streams for the tax purposes.
Any property taxes?
Yes.
Whether it's separate income streams or whether it's just one, they are on different premise incomes, are they not? So should they not be able to just determine based on that?
Well, that's my point. If the city has the separate income streams, for example, restaurant, supermarket, whatever else it may be, and they have separate income streams, then the owner is able to tell. But if they blend it all together as a neighborhood shopping center or something,
Right.
there are times when that can be very problematic, because now the owner has to figure out how each tenant is assessed, in order to meet the obligations of the lease for the allocation of the taxes. It's why regional shopping malls get very problematic, because you have many different parties, all with an interest. They want to make sure their portion of the assessment is.
So just for my information, a property tax bill, is that given to the owner?
Yes, yeah, because only one party receives the tax bill and can
And then he
appeal.
decides how to allocate it among the tenants?
Right, and that's dependent on the leases. In most cases, like in this case, it's fine. I believe it's all proportionate share, so every tenant just pays on their square footage. That's great. All they need to know is the amount of the tax, and they divide it by the square footage. But there are many,
Wouldn't there also be some concern to location? I mean, when you talked about being at the back, these people don't see you from the street. They might, and the only reason they're going to you is because they know you're there and they need to go there, but there's no impulse buying.
yeah,
And sometimes a restaurant needs that
right.
in the front
Yeah.
to be able to be seen.
Yes.
So wouldn't that be taken into consideration? Or that would be taken into consideration in the rent that you're paying?
Yeah, I think that would be, it's a great point. I think it's gonna be considered no matter how the income streams are portioned because of the rent that's applied to that space. But just the concern is that if the city was thinking by that logic to maybe start merging, which I've seen happen a little bit more this cycle, I just wanted it to be on the record, and I've also described this to Mr. Gordevant, that with retail it can be problematic. So I just wanted to make that comment as an aside for the city's sake.
Well, I think when you're combining just to get the actual total value, is one thing, but you still got the income streams and you still got the leases, so the owner can still be able to allocate it.
Yeah, what I'll be able to do with this, if we have leases that are based on contribution to assessment, is I can take Mr. Fougier's analysis and break them back out into the income streams, so that's great.
Yeah.
Okay, it's my understanding 55 Sage Creek has been withdrawn.
Yes.
Okay, so we'll deal with 1500 Dakota. Yep. Okay, when you're ready, Mr. Assessor?
So this is 1500 Dakota Street. The roll number is 080060988800. You can see photographs at the rear of my brief. There's a Scotiabank, dance studio, and Sobeys is the largest tenant there. And you can see the overhead photography on page 23. Just while we have this page open, I'd like to just quickly point out that there is some land reserved potentially for future development alongside Dakota Street there. We have not made any adjustment for excess land here, but I did want to note it and it to be recalled when I'm giving my recommendation that it's a portion of value that we haven't pursued that may be inherent on the property.
And where's that located?
So it's just in the front.
On the front
Yeah.
there, oh, okay. Thank you. Is that just used for parking, right?
Well, this small area here, I think it's just grassed over. And I would speculate that it's maybe 6,000 or 7,000 square feet. So this area just right here, you can just see it's sort of a darker gray dingy color, not taken in the summertime, I guess. So it's actually not being used, as far as I know, for anything current. You can see that there's no real trees on that portion.
And it's not paved or anything.
It's not paved, no. And so, we have our original workups are on page 4 and page 5 of my brief. And then we have the recommendation that I've handed out. What we've done here is we've put it all to one income stream. Again, we've said that this is a neighborhood shopping center, and you know, the buildings are all attached. Again, it's even less likely that they would be split out to multiple roll numbers. And in terms of our recommendation, the original numbers that we had are table driven, but our recommendation that we've made actually follows suits with Mr. Slaughter's workup in terms of the rental rates and the areas. So we've actually followed all the premises, and the rental rates follow Mr. Slaughter's brief. So just to narrow it a little bit, I think we have a disagreement when it comes to the 2% other in terms of the expenses. And I think that's where the bulk of our disagreement is. So we've applied 2%. I believe Mr. Slaughter is looking for 7%. But at any rate, did you want me to propose my recommendation? Yeah, so...
If this is a recommendation you're making, yes.
Yeah, then I'll just come back to the presentation after, not to give away the ending here, but, so we're prepared to make a recommendation of $10,849,000.
That's by assumption you're not in agreement with that value, Mr.
Yeah,
Slaughter.
the owner didn't wish to accept that.
So you may proceed.
Yeah, and so just to continue on quickly with the workup on the recommendation. Just going to refer to the subject's income and expense mailer. On page 18, on page 18 here, you can see that the net operating income for the year 2017 is $817,838. So the net operating income that we are recommending is $792,002. So it's about 20,000 less, a little bit more. And in 2018, which is only relevant up to April 1st, but just as for a general concept, I can say that the net operating income is higher than in 2017. And then I also have the net operating income for 2016, where it's $764,566. Now that's going back a little bit in time, but just to show that the net operating income that the property owners have reported is higher than what we're proposing. And part of that is explainable that they're actually fully leased. And so realistically, the number that is listed here doesn't contemplate vacancy allowance or any utilities that weren't paid, common utilities that weren't paid because of vacancy. However, our hope was that our number would be reflective of market vacancy. And we would be okay to have, again, we're using the actuals in the calculation here. It's just the, we are allowing vacancy and the expenses don't line up exactly with the subject's mailer for 2017. But again, the end result is that we are allowing some value for the vacancy allowance as well as the shortfall. And again, I would like to point out that there is that small spot on the front of the parcel that could potentially be a site for future development. I haven't researched that in particular, but I believe that there is some value that's not accounted for. To what scale, I'm not entirely sure, but just to say, to give that further consideration. So that's my presentation.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, questions for the assessor?
Thanks. Mr. Fougier, so just on that topic, you mentioned the possibility of excess land. To confirm, the property was constructed in 1994, correct?
Correct.
So there's been 16 years that the owner has not developed that parcel.
16, longer than 16.
Oh, sorry. Right.
Yeah.
26.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely concede that it's not it's not the next hot area or anything like that, but as neighborhoods fill out to the south, I think that through time this property has maybe had some vacancy issues, but I think that it's again, it's 100% leased up here, so it would suggest to me that at some point it could potentially become feasible to put a smaller couple CRUs there.
But as you mentioned, we haven't really looked into this as far as if there's setbacks required or sightline restrictions or restrictions
Correct,
because
I have not.
Yeah, restrictions because of the proximity of residential. So this is strictly just a hypothesis that.
Correct.
And that area to be developed, of course, we'd have to consider the parking ratio that would be acceptable by zoning. So if it was able to be developed, it would be a smaller area developed in order to have the parking ratio as well.
Depending on the total parking on the site, yes.
Right, okay, thank you. Overall, though, you'd agree what we're looking at, and I think what you're getting at with the possibility of excess land value is an overall market value of the property. And in doing so, and you alluded to this in your analysis, we're not just looking at, via the income approach, an actual income at the place at the time of the assessment, but rather stabilized year one. So for example, if there was no physical vacancy, of course the market would consider that there's a risk of vacancy, and these are the things that are recognized in the stabilized. And that's why you're not relying 100% on the actual income at the time of the...
Correct.
They're closest to the assessment date. The 5% allowance, you mentioned that the city's allowing 2% currently. And I'm correct in stating that historically the total allowance was 7%, it was 5 and 2. Is that correct?
Correct.
And if I understand correctly, the reason that the 5% has been not allowed for the 2020 cycle is that the city is considering that to be a management fee, which in fact is recovered. Or is that changed?
I think that's generally true.
So historically...
But I think the attempt was to review net leases and see how they measured up the property as a whole. So I think the way that we've looked at it is that really the only other non-recoverable income is of the scope of about 2%. And that's what our analysis has been.
Okay.
So it's not necessarily that we were looking at it in terms of management and saying we're no longer accepting a deduction for management. It's more so that the modelers, after the review of the financials of a property, determined that these are net rates, net of everything, and that when you look at it, there's only about 2% that is non-recoverable, and that still may include management or other types of management, or a variety of expenses.
Okay, so nothing in the market has changed as far as recoverable management fees that the city's trying to recognize. This is just re-looking at this allowance and determining that the 7% previously applied was too great, and that 2% would be applied instead. And that 2% includes structural reserve, is that correct? It's all of the capital improvements over
Right.
the life of the property, amortized? And it does not include, from what I understand, what we typically call non-recovered expenses, leasing commissions and tenant improvements.
I believe it does not.
Right, okay. You would agree that those expenses are real in the market, though?
They are real. I think that they can be applied differently, and I think that you know, if an owner is acquiring tenants and collecting a lease commission, I think it could be of different rates, and I think that determination has been made that that's not typically recoverable. And just in terms of where they included on their financials, they listed in a non-recoverable spot on their financial forms. And so it's not something that we give an allowance for and then associate more as a business expense.
Okay, so it's considered a non-recoverable expense that the owners cannot recover from the tenants, and therefore it's not considered in the analysis of the NOI.
Correct.
I think that's all the questions.
Thank you. Ms. McFadden?
I have no further questions.
Mr. Phillip?
Just a little clearance when you say you don't consider that because you can't recover from the tenant, but the landlord still has incurred that. And so,
Right.
as an accountant, you would be including that as an expense in arriving with your net operating income for the year.
So we've taken our position from municipal board precedent with the view that these nevertheless are business expenses, and that a property owner can incur all sorts of expenses that are real expenses, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they should be deducted. For example, if the owner uses a car and expends it through the business, or different types of professional fees that may not be typical, we don't necessarily deduct that from the net operating income. And regardless, in this case, we're seeing all of the deductions in the mailer. I have not, we're still coming in at a lower value than the net operating income.
For that particular year.
Correct, and as well as other years as well.
Thank you.
So you're making a point that the net operating income of 817 that's reported on page 18 is higher than what you come in at, but there's a lot of recoveries here as well, is there not, that aren't included in your workup? Like the rent is the rent.
The rent is the rent.
You've got like 860 on your rent, they're saying 833, but there's a significant amount of recoveries that aren't.
Right. So the net effect is that through our allowances and our parameters, we're arriving at a different and a lower net operating income than the subject properties financial documents at the reference date. So, you know, we have 2% here. They have a variety of expenses. If you were to add them all together, they may not be 2%. They may be a little bit higher, a little bit lower. However, we haven't necessarily, you know, included all of the recoveries are implied when we're using the net rates. So the expenses really comes down to that the amount is supposed to be the difference between what's recovered and what isn't recovered. And again, I haven't looked at the particular numbers. However, you can see that the net operating income, once we go through those expenses, is lower, in fact, than the net operating income reported for 2017 and 2018 as well, although, again, only a portion of that year is before the reference date.
And just a minor one, I noticed the mezzanine has disappeared in your valuation. Is that rolled into this new rate that you've applied?
Yeah, what I'm trying to do here is to honor what Mr. Slaughter has used as their actuals, and in terms of our methodology, we would still keep the mezzanine space. We're not going to remove it from our system, but in terms of the value it's contributing, for the sake of making a recommendation, I've conceded to Mr. Slaughter's numbers.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Slaughter, go ahead from you, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fougier has gone through the description of the property, so I won't reiterate any of that. It's an older property that's starting to show its age. It was built in 1994. I would again like to commend Mr. Fougier and Mr. Cortvet for being very open in listening to the concerns that we had on behalf of our clients. And I think they're being very fair. In this case, though, the owner cannot accept this value. The reason being is predominantly, well, two reasons. One is it's a 19% increase over what was negotiated last cycle for a property that hasn't fundamentally changed. But more importantly from our standpoint is that this issue of the non-recovered expenses is very important. And I mentioned earlier today that our clients have agreed to certain values that have been proposed, but it's the overall value that we're accepting and not how we get to that value. So in other cases, if the value was fair, we're not going to worry about how it gets there.
Made it up.
In this case, we have a concern about the delta between what the owner would accept and the offer, and really the fundamental difference is this issue of non-recovered expenses. So I'd like to kind of focus on that, if I may. Just a couple quick points to begin, though. Mr. Fougier has agreed to everything else that we've proposed, and what that entails is that we're looking at the actual income in place as the best indicators of market in this case. Most of the leases are fairly recent or have stepped up. We actually have increases on some of the rates or rents from what the city originally applied, the Sobeys being an example. We're using the actual rent that's attained, whether it be including the mezzanine or not, doesn't matter, it's the total rental income. And everything else the city has agreed to in our position, including the capitalization rate and the shortfall. The non-recovered expenses, though, is where we've hit a bit of a disagreement, and I understand the city's position, but we, with respect, completely disagree. If I may, we've done a presentation on this issue. That's very long, and I won't go through the whole thing, because I think everybody here has heard our position on this. But I'd like to just hone in on a few key points. Yeah, that's it, the non-recovered expenses. I'd like to hone in on a few key points that this study goes through. Number one is that there is a difference between what's recoverable and what is non-recoverable. Not what is unrecovered, but rather what a tenant or what an owner can't recover from their tenants. And one of the best quotes on this comes from the Appraisal Institute on page 4. And they really break down this issue of what is it that we should be talking about with non-recovered expenses versus recovered. And again, I'd like to commend Mr. Fougier because he's not saying that the city's changing their opinion on recovered management expenses. It's just a difference of opinion of what's included. Page 4, this is coming from the office property valuation text from the University of British Columbia. Operating costs and property taxes, they're called recoverable expenses. These include items as payroll, cleaning, utilities, maintenance, repairs, grounds and parking area maintenance, and management fees. So it's very clear right off the top that management fees are in the market typically recovered. If they're not, what you have is a semi-gross rent that has to be adjusted. So that's not the issue here. The issue is what is non-recovered, and that goes down to the second point, non-recoverable expenses. Leasing and capital costs. The appraiser should also account for non-recoverable expenses, also called non-rechargeable expenses. The most important non-recoverable cost items to be aware of are space marketing costs, which include both tenant inducements and leasing costs, and an allowance for structural or mechanical repairs. Now, historically, as I mentioned, there was 2 allowances. There was a 5% and a 2%. Our understanding was the 2% referred to structural reserve. All the capital improvements over the life of a property. In this study, we look at that as well, and we feel that 2% might not actually be sufficient, because you can imagine with a property such as this, you have parking lot repairs, you have roof repairs, you have all these things that the leases will not let you recapture from the tenants. We're not contesting that, though. What we're saying is there are additional, very real costs that every owner incurs over the life of the property or their holding period that they can't recover from the tenants. The main ones are really the space marketing costs, leasing costs, and tenant inducements. This is fundamentally why we can't take a 1-year income statement and say that this should be the gospel for the basis of the value of the property, because we're trying to stabilize a typical year 1. Great example, this property itself at the reference date has 0% vacancy. An investor would never apply 0% vacancy. They'd have some allowance for a risk of vacancy over the life of the property, because we're looking at the potential future benefits brought to a present value. So we apply a vacancy allowance, and we apply a shortfall allowance to that vacancy. In the same manner, historically, there's been an allowance for these type of expenses that will be incurred over the life of the property, for the leasing costs and the tenant improvements. Typically, when Sobeys is attained as a tenant, there's going to be a definite leasing cost to bring them in, and there's going to usually be quite a hefty tenant inducement by the landlord in order to meet their expectations. There's been a conversation about, an ongoing conversation about what weight to put on previous municipal board decisions in this issue, and I think this is a very important point. Mr. Fougier brought up the point that the city believes that these decisions, which say we will not deduct tenant improvements and leasing costs for valuation, be taken at face value, meaning there should be no allowance. And let me please put those decisions in context. And if I may, I'll go back to the beginning of how these decisions are laid out. 1994 was the very first decision. It was for the Richardson building. It's called the Richardson decision. Every other decision since then has simply said that the board has deliberated this issue in 2 decisions, the Richardson building and one called National Trust from 1997. That's all they've said. We've talked about this before, and we won't make a deduction for those items. In those decisions, what was being asked by the owner is that all of the tenant inducements required to bring in the rents in place at the time of the valuation, all the costs, lump sum, be deducted from the rents to bring the net rent down to what's called a net effective. So if you say that it cost $1 million and the typical lease is 10 years, they're asking that $100,000 be taken off the rents. It's not an unreasonable request, but it's not appropriate in this world of assessment because of the way capitalization rates are derived. And keep in mind, the 5% allowance was in place at the time of this request. So the board was left with a question of whether to erode greatly the income in place for a net effective when they're already allowing a 5% deduction for non-recovered expenses. Now, this is a second point I'd like to point out on page 2. The city's manual at the time of these decisions, both 1994 and 1997, all the way up to 2009 actually, the city's manual for the 5% was very clear that even with net leases and competent management, there will still be additional management expenses incurred by the landlord that are non-recoverable from the tenants. We've already heard what the definition and appraisal is of non-recovered expenses, space marketing costs. So, to put ourselves in context of what was being requested of the municipal board is to make a deduction that was already being allowed on an amortized basis with the 5% allowance. I don't blame them for saying no. Of course they would not make that deduction. That's not at all to say that they're ignoring those costs. To ignore those costs would be in contradiction to the Assessment Act, because the Assessment Act is based on market value. And if you take that statement to mean we should ignore these costs, what you're fundamentally saying is we should increase all values by 5%. We're no longer at market value. So which is more plausible? That these quotes are being taken out of context from what was actually being asked, or that the municipal board gave the green card to increase assessments by 5% in contradiction to the Assessment Act? And we maintain that it's the former. They already had an allowance in place, they're not going to make a further deduction. What we're left with today is following that logic. If we're valuing a property, the market does not ignore these costs, but they don't take a lump sum deduction either. They apply an allowance. This is fundamental in any derivation of cap rates that we see in the market. It's how we do capitalization rates. So you can't just take that away. Other assessment jurisdictions on either side of Manitoba allow this allowance, and for the reasons that I'm describing. The Saskatchewan manual states that they will have an allowance for non-recovered expenses. And on page 6, they go on to describe those expenses. They include legal and audit fees, structural repairs and repairs which are capital in nature. I already mentioned that that's in the bucket of 2%. Advertising and promotion, and leasing commissions. If we go on to page 7, we see the Ontario manual from MPAC. Again, non-recovered expenses. There's an allowance allowed in the valuation on an annual basis that's referring to non-recoverable expenses, which may include such items as marketing costs, large capital cost projects, legal and auditing fees, and ongoing expenses associated with the vacant areas of the building, which is shortfall. The point is that every assessing authority around us recognizes this allowance. Appraisal theory says we can't ignore this allowance. The market tells us these expenses are real. We completely disagree that this allowance should be disregarded for the first time in 25 years of doing the income approach. That's fundamentally the difference. The city has agreed with us on the actual income in place and capitalization rate. We simply ask that the 5% be added to the 2% for structural reserve for a proper and responsible amortization of these costs before we capitalize it into the assessment value. And if we do so, in our presentation on page 10, in blue is that main difference, 7% rather than 2%, and it would bring us to a total value of $10,319,000. That is basically our presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Sir, do we turn the strobe lights off?
I have no idea.
Thank you.
Thank you. What's that?
Lights were flickering.
Mr. Fougere, questions for the applicant?
No, thank you.
Ms. McFadden?
I don't have any further questions.
Mr. Phillip?
I'm a little confused.
I went through that pretty fast, so please,
Not
any
really.
questions you have.
I can understand what you're trying to say. But all these other properties that you agreed to with the assessor, did it include this 5%?
That's why I wanted to make it very clear at the very beginning that when we agree to a value, it's because the owner agrees to an overall value. We did not agree with the application of only 2%, but there are other things in that valuation which led us to a value that was acceptable.
So in one way or the other, you got down to a number that was agreeable to, right?
Exactly.
So in this particular case, to get down to a number that maybe is more agreeable, you're wanting to apply the 5%.
Well, that makes it sound like we're picking and choosing, which I want to be clear that we're trying not to do. We're trying to get to the final number. In this case, everything that we're asking has been offered by the city, but that one very key point hasn't. In the other cases, there were things that were perhaps a little over what we would have typically accepted, like more generous than. So it compensated for the lack of the non-recovered expense allowance. Again, we're not agreeing to any,
But then that is picking and choosing, right?
well, I
Because if
guess,
you hadn't agreed, you'd then bring up the 5%.
yeah, if everything else was to our satisfaction or the client's satisfaction, except the 5%, we would definitely bring it up. If we get to a final value that seems appropriate, then that's fine, we don't care how we get there.
The 5%. Is that a 5% for each and every property, 5% is appropriate?
Yes, that's what this study goes through, is what's a typical allowance. And we go through including all those items I mentioned, and the average that we come up with is about 7%. But 5% is typically what's applied, and we would have to change our entire capitalization rate model if we were going to use 7. Because in the end, we're still coming down to a value. So it's 5% is the number that we are accepting in this case. And that's across the life of the property. So you may have years where you have 0 because the property is 100% leased, so you won't have any leasing commissions or tenant inducements. But that's not the point. The point is that anybody buying the property would expect that they would incur these expenses over the life of the property at an amortized rate we calculate at 5%.
I have another question, if I may.
Yeah.
Yep, go ahead.
You're referring to, of course, a good example is Sobeys. And in effect, to either bring it originally in or to retain it or whatever, isn't that cost that's incurred at that particular time is a one-shot deal? It happened in that year, you're gonna write it off in that particular year.
Yeah.
And then your rent from then on doesn't have that cost. That cost was an upfront cost?
Right, but what we're stating is that over the life of the property, you're going to have that cost every time a tenant either renews or vacates. And so that's why the market will apply an allowance, rather than, see, back to the point of the board decisions, what the owner was asking in those cases is, Sobeys cost us $1 million. We'd like $1 million taken from the value, or whatever it was over the life of the lease. And that's not appropriate in assessment purposes. But what is that over the life of the property, those kind of costs will probably average 5%.
So you're saying that's hidden in that 5 or 7%?
Yeah, that's exactly what the 5% is. So my point is, if we're not deducting for those costs at the time that they're incurred, and we also don't allow any sort of amortized allowance, we're coming up with an NOI that is 5% higher than what the market would typically value the property at.
So does it boil down to the fact that every year we should just use what the net income is?
No, because we're trying to stabilize a one-year income that is the best income to use for the future expectations of the property. So that's why we would allow a vacancy allowance, even though the property is 100% occupied. And we must allow for the other non-recovered expenses that the property is likely going to incur. It's putting yourself in the mind of an investor. What are they going to think is their typical year one income, and how do they capitalize that?
When the person sells it and he's negotiating to sell, I'm just asking these questions that come to my mind.
Yeah.
Would he not be asking for a higher rate because it's totally rented and leased out?
Higher sale price, you mean?
Right.
Well, that would be, if I was buying the property, I would say to myself, do I expect to have 100% occupancy over my holding period?
But dependent to terms of the lease when you take it over, right?
Right, well, that's a great point that, if you look at this property right now, it's at a point in time that has 100% occupancy. 4 leases expire within a year and a half. And you can see that from the expiry dates that I show in our workup. So if I'm buying the property, do I think I'm gonna have 100% occupancy without needing to expend any marketing costs, again, over the holding period? And the answer we submit is no.
No.
Right.
Depending on the size of the tenant too. It might not be the principal tenant, or the anchor tenant, and it might be just one small little units or something like that.
That's right.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Can I have nothing further? Is there desire for summation on this property, Fougere?
Just a very brief one. We are recognizing vacancy. we are trying to recognize any non-recovered expenses. Our net operating income is lower than the 2018, lower than the 2017, and pretty close to the 2016, as well as there is a potentially developable, I say potentially because I haven't looked into the matter, pad site, if you will, at the front of the property, that I believe would add some value to the property, but we're not pursuing that, so we're looking at $10,849,000.
Mr. Slaughter?
Just to reiterate 2 points, that I think the discussion about that land is completely a hypothesis. I think there's very good reason why it hasn't been developed. And secondly, again, just to reiterate that we have to caution ourselves from using the actual NOI at the reference date when the property is 100% occupied, because the market would never be so optimistic. There has to be an allowance for the items that we discussed. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Curiously, can I ask one question?
Yes, certainly.
In this piece of property that is sitting there with grass on it right now, I don't know actually the size, would it be something like a restaurant on its own sitting at the front, that in a corner that you would rent out to, something like a standalone restaurant that would end enough parking to accommodate that?
I think that's the hypothesis Mr. Fougier is describing, and when we do an analysis like this, we always look at factors like that for the highest and best use of the site. But there are a few things that would caution us against just simply saying that we should allow for value. Land has to have a development potential to have value. If this property is from 1994, and this is owned by a very reputable, or managed by a very reputable company, I think if it had potential, it would have been developed. The fact it hasn't raises many questions which have to be addressed before we apply any value. Are there sightline restrictions for the tenants behind what would hypothetically be a restaurant? Do you have the parking ratio which would accommodate it? Right off the bat, I'd suggest no, because it's a relatively small land-to-building ratio. Are there restrictions because of the residential housing right beside that vacant spot? Are there setbacks in the zoning?
There could also be competition.
The market, well, exactly, the market, there might be no
Also
demand.
could be maybe restaurants that are already in the shopping center and saying, I don't want you to put another competitor in there and take away from me.
Yeah, so what I went through is simply the legal and physical comments. What you're describing is the third most important, supply-demand. So before we even entertain a value on that, there's a lot of questions to ask.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I guess in fairness, was there anything else you wanted to add at that point? Kind of had a summation there.
Sorry if I interrupted.
No problem. Next we'll deal with 2855 Pembina.
So 2855 Pembina, oh, actually, sorry, I have another recommendation here.
Thank you. When you're ready, Mr. Fougier?
So the property here, 2855 Pembina Highway, the roll number is 0306071500. And you can see the property on page 22 on the back side of my brief. They've recently given a cosmetic renovation to the exterior of the mall, and they have a newer liquor mart that's been completed there recently. And for a recommendation, You can compare it to page 4, where we have our original assessment. We've adjusted the overall rents, mostly following the actuals. And we've kept our 25% vacancy. Obviously, some of those rental rates were surmised by the quality of space that they had, not the actual rent in place, because there has been significant vacancy at this property. And that's the only change that we made, was to the rental rates. And so the resulting value is $10,282,000.
Yeah, Mr. Slaughter, are you in agreement with the valuation? Or
Yeah, just to.
Final value?
Again, final value, not how we get there.
Ms. McFadden, any
No
questions?
question.
And I have no questions. Assuming there's nothing further than on this property. Thank you. Do we have one more property to deal with?
Number 8.
567? When you're ready, Mr. Assessor?
I have another recommendation here.
Thank you.
So this is a case where, sorry, I should read the roll number and the address. So 560 Pembina Highway, roll number 1201521150. So this is a case where we looked at the number of income streams, and again, we've tried to reduce them to reflect the nature of the property. And so we're using an overall capitalization rate of 7.3%. And we've looked at the performance of the mall over the last few years, and basically arrived at the net operating income by reviewing the net operating income of the mailers and ensuring that there's a vacancy allowance there. And so we have the $11,787,000 value, and then unfortunately I missed, it was supposed to all print on the same page, but it didn't, so I had to add it by hand at the end there. So the number that you see below that is the cost of the gas equipment. So that's an additional $179,000, and so the total is $11,966,000 that we're going to recommend.
Thank you. Mr. Slaughter, are you in agreement with the value?
Client accepts the final value.
Questions, Ms. McFadden?
No questions.
Mr. Phillips? Just clarification, the 93 square feet, $130, that's the gas kiosk?
Correct.
And that's down substantially from what you originally,
It is, so similarly to Mr. Slaughter, we were looking at a value as a whole that we were satisfied with.
let's see.
Can I ask one question?
You may?
of the assessor, is it the city's policy to recognize these things as one economic unit and give a similar cap rate across two different things that are going on?
So, it is a bit of a nuanced position that we have. So we don't necessarily do that in all cases.
Okay.
We try to follow a logic of, well, is it, does it have its own entrance? Could it be a separate roll number? And because there's a variety of cases where we see a property that realistically looks like it could be all one economic unit, but there's a piece of maybe a pad site that has its own ownership and is different. And it also goes to how the model is built and analyzed. So some of the way that the values are calibrated, you need to have a separate income stream to properly account for what the market information is telling us. In terms of what we've set up with our computer system and our other income streams. So it's one part, we're trying to be logical about it, and another part, we're trying to be fair and accurate given the restraints of our system.
It's a
I don't
very
know if that-
diplomatic answer.
I don't know if that helped any, but
Thank you.
we do try our best to be consistent, and collapsing down the income streams to something a little bit more manageable without altering the value as a whole is something that we're trying to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Mr. Slaughter, any further presentation from you?
No, it's an interesting question though about because we look at it from the other side. We'll be analyzing what the city did in cases, and in the end it should be a blended cap rate which makes sense to the market. So if we have our capitalization rate study for retail properties and a number of the strip malls have gas bars, and it's indicating that we should be around 7.2% or something, well then we wouldn't agree that the gas bar should be at 6 and the mall at 7.2. Where it gets interesting is if you have something like a regional shopping mall, where the cap rate will be relatively low, say 5.75, and you've got, let's say, a standalone McDonald's who pays their taxes as a separate entity, even though it's part of the large tax bill, and they're on their own site at the front of the regional shopping mall. And if they said we want to be subdivided or even just assessed separately, well, they would be assessed like a standalone restaurant with a cap rate of, let's say, 7%. But because they're not, all of a sudden they're at 5.75, which causes them to be at a very big disadvantage. And therefore, in those cases, we suggest that the city should probably look twice at the pads.
Okay, thank you.
There's a little bit extra thought on it.
Okay, that's the final property we're dealing with. Desire for summation on, or anything further, Mr. Slaughter?
That's great.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you.
The orders will be out in due course, and I will call the hearing to a close. We will take a 5-minute break.